In 1989, a brutal double murder shattered the illusion of the perfect Beverly Hills family. Two wealthy brothers, Lyle and Eric Menendez, stood accused of gunning down their own parents. Was it a cold-blooded act of greed, or a desperate escape from years of hidden abuse? The story begins on a warm August evening in 1989, inside one of the most exclusive neighborhoods of Southern California. The sprawling Calabasas mansion of the Menendez family stood as a symbol of wealth and achievement. From the outside, it looked like the picture of success. Grand entranceways, manicured lawns, expensive cars in the driveway. Neighbors often saw the family attending upscale events, dressed impeccably, a representation of the American dream. But behind the heavy doors of that estate, there existed an invisible tension, one that no outsider could fully sense until it erupted in the most violent way imaginable. Jose Menendez, the patriarch, had risen from humble beginnings in Cuba to become a wealthy entertainment executive in the United States. He was admired for his determination and business instincts, a man who seemed to thrive under pressure. Yet, he was also feared by those closest to him. Colleagues remembered him as demanding and sometimes ruthless, expecting perfection from everyone in his orbit. Inside the family home, his strict nature manifested in the form of high expectations for his sons, Lyle and Eric. Both boys grew up in privilege, expensive schooling, private tennis coaches, luxury cars, but this privilege came at a cost. They lived under the weight of a father who expected excellence and absolute obedience. Their mother, Kitty, presented a softer image in public, but her life was marred by deep struggles. Friends later described her as warm and loving, yet also deeply troubled. Depression haunted her, and she reportedly battled dependence on alcohol and prescription drugs. While she was devoted to her family, there was an undercurrent of instability that left her emotionally unavailable at times. Within the home, the dynamic between a dominating father, a fragile mother, and two young men searching for identity created an environment of dysfunction that would ultimately spiral out of control. On the evening of August 20, 1989, the Menendez home became a scene of unimaginable horror. That night, Jose and Kitty relaxed in the family den, watching television together. Lyle and Eric entered the room, each carrying a shotgun. The first shot was aimed at their father. It struck him in the back of the head, killing him almost instantly. Kitty, startled and terrified, tried to flee, but she didn't get far. The brothers fired multiple rounds, hitting her in the legs, arms, and chest before delivering a fatal shot. The sheer brutality of the attack stunned even seasoned detectives who arrived later at the scene. Blood covered the den, furniture was torn apart by gunfire, and the once elegant room looked like a war zone. When police first arrived, they were cautious not to jump to conclusions. Beverly Hills was not known for random home invasions or violent crime, but officers initially considered the possibility of a mob hit or robbery gone wrong. Jose's high-profile career in the entertainment business made such theories seem plausible. However, there were immediate red flags. There was no forced entry, no valuables taken, and no clear evidence of an intruder. It was as though the killers had walked comfortably into the house, knowing exactly where to find the victims. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric attempted to construct an alibi. They claimed they had gone to the movies that night, and when they returned home, they found their parents murdered. On the surface, their performance looked convincing. They cried, they appeared shaken, and they told police what had happened. But in the days and weeks that followed, their behavior told another story. Rather than withdrawing into grief, the brothers launched into a life of extravagance. Lyle bought an expensive Rolex watch and a Porsche, while Eric invested in a new business venture and hired a personal tennis coach. They dined at fine restaurants, shopped in luxury boutiques, and spent recklessly, as though the sudden removal of their parents had unlocked both money and freedom. This conduct alarmed detectives, but suspicion alone was not enough to bring charges. The Menendez case lingered in uncertainty, with investigators struggling to find the crucial link between the brothers and the crime. For nearly half a year, no arrests were made. During this time, the young men became increasingly reckless, flaunting their wealth, traveling, and attempting to bury the truth under layers of denial. But guilt has a way of surfacing, and it did so through Eric. Haunted by what they had done, Eric sought help from a psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. In confidential sessions, he confessed everything: the planning, the execution, the aftermath. He revealed that he and Lyle had killed their parents, admitting the details of the crime. These sessions, however, became the turning point of the investigation. The brothers did not know that Dr. Oziel's mistress would eventually reveal the tapes of these confessions to the police, shattering the illusion of their innocence. Suddenly, investigators had what they had been waiting for: direct evidence that implicated the brothers. Still, the case was not simple. Legal battles quickly erupted over whether the taped confessions were admissible in court. Defense attorneys argued that doctor-patient privilege made the tapes untouchable, while prosecutors insisted the evidence was too vital to ignore. The matter dragged on, but eventually the court allowed key portions of the tapes to be introduced. By March of 1990, the brothers were arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder. The shockwaves were immediate. The idea that two wealthy, privileged young men from Beverly Hills had gunned down their parents sent ripples through the media. This was not a typical crime story. It was wealth and horror intertwined, the kind of narrative that captured the imagination of an audience already fascinated by celebrity scandals and family secrets. Soon, the Menendez brothers were household names, and their trial promised to be one of the most watched legal spectacles of the decade. But before the world saw them as killers, they were seen as victims, sons who had allegedly grown up under unbearable pressure and trauma. Their defense attorneys began preparing a strategy that would portray the brothers not as greedy heirs, but as broken young men who had suffered for years under the control of a cruel father and a negligent mother. This version of the story would divide America, drawing a line between those who believed the brothers were entitled murderers and those who believed they were desperate survivors who struck back against their abusers. As the 1990s dawned, television news stations and tabloids seized on every detail of the Menendez saga. Cameras followed the brothers in handcuffs, journalists dug into their past, and analysts debated what could drive children to kill their own parents. To the public, the Menendez case was more than a murder. It was a window into the dark side of the American dream, a family that had everything but harmony, a household where wealth and privilege could not shield against the human capacity for destruction. The first part of this story closes not with resolution, but with anticipation. The crime had been committed, the suspects had been arrested, but the question of why lingered like a shadow. Was it greed, a hunger for inheritance, and a desire for freedom from strict parents? Or was it the culmination of years of abuse and torment that left the brothers believing they had no other choice? The answers would unfold in courtrooms, in testimonies, and in the hearts of millions of viewers who tuned in to watch the tragedy of the Menendez family play out like a grim theater on the national stage. The trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez began in the early 1990s, but it was no ordinary courtroom proceeding. From the start, it was clear that this case would capture the nation's attention in ways rarely seen before. For the first time, a high-profile murder trial involving the children of immense privilege was televised in its entirety. Americans were able to watch, day after day, as the intimate details of a family's darkest secrets unfolded in front of cameras. It was courtroom drama transformed into spectacle, and the Menendez brothers, once anonymous sons of a powerful executive, became the faces of one of the most talked-about criminal cases in modern American history. The prosecution approached the case with a straightforward argument. This was a murder born of greed. They contended that the brothers, living lives of luxury but under the control of their parents, wanted freedom. They wanted not only control of their own destinies but also the vast inheritance that would come with their parents' deaths. Prosecutors highlighted the brothers' extravagant spending spree immediately following the murders, pointing to the Rolex watches, luxury cars, shopping sprees, and business ventures as clear evidence of motive. They presented them as spoiled young men who had grown impatient waiting for their share of wealth and instead decided to take it by force. But the defense told a radically different story. They painted the Menendez brothers not as cold-blooded killers but as deeply damaged children who had lived through years of abuse. In court, their attorneys claimed that Jose Menendez had been physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive toward his sons, particularly Eric. They argued that Kitty, emotionally fragile and dependent on substances, had turned a blind eye to the suffering of her children. The killings, they claimed, were not acts of greed but desperate measures taken by two young men who believed they were in imminent danger of being destroyed by their parents. The power of this defense lay not only in the words of the lawyers but in the raw, emotional testimony of the brothers themselves. When Eric took the stand, he broke down repeatedly, recounting graphic and disturbing allegations of sexual abuse by his father. He described being controlled, humiliated, and violated, and claimed that the trauma had left him feeling trapped, powerless, and terrified. Lyle supported these accounts, describing a childhood marked by fear, manipulation, and an oppressive household environment. Their testimony shocked the courtroom, and for millions watching at home, it was nearly impossible to separate fact from performance. Were these tears genuine recollections of trauma, or were they carefully rehearsed appeals for sympathy? Jurors were deeply affected by the conflicting narratives. Some sympathized with the brothers, believing their accounts of years of torment and seeing the murders as acts of survival. Others remained skeptical, pointing to the lavish lifestyle after the killings as proof that greed was the true motivator. The trial became less about the crime itself and more about how one interpreted the complicated dynamics of the Menendez household. The defense did not deny the killings. Instead, they focused entirely on the why, and that why divided the nation. Television audiences were equally captivated. For months, daytime television was dominated by the Menendez trial. People tuned in as if they were following a serialized drama, debating the case with the intensity usually reserved for sports or politics. Talk shows dissected the latest testimony, newspapers printed daily analyses, and psychologists appeared on television to speculate about the psychological state of the brothers. The trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was entertainment, a grim reflection of America's fascination with crime, privilege, and family secrets. Despite all the drama, the first trial ended without resolution. Jurors could not agree on a verdict. The split reflected the broader public debate. Some believed the brothers were victims. Others believed they were calculating murderers. The result was a mistrial, and with it came frustration, confusion, and anticipation for what would happen next. The mistrial also meant the brothers would face another round in court, and the nation would once again be drawn into the spectacle. The second trial, held in 1995, marked a turning point. This time, the defense faced far more obstacles. The judge ruled that the televised coverage of the first trial had influenced public perception, and so the retrial was not broadcast. The decision limited the media circus but also changed the atmosphere. Without cameras in the room, the proceedings felt less like a public drama and more like a traditional trial. The defense still focused on the claims of abuse, but the prosecution sharpened its approach, doubling down on the narrative of greed. Prosecutors highlighted every dollar the brothers had spent after the murders, every flashy purchase, every business deal. They reminded the jury that the killings had been carried out with shocking brutality. Jose had been shot point-blank in the head, Kitty was riddled with bullets, and neither parent was given a chance to survive. They described the act as deliberate, merciless, and entirely consistent with a plan to inherit wealth rather than a split-second act of self-preservation. The defense countered, but their arguments carried less weight this time. They repeated the allegations of abuse, but without the televised element, the emotional impact seemed less powerful. The jury had to weigh two versions of the same family story, one of abuse and survival and one of entitlement and greed. In March 1996, the verdict came down. Both Lyle and Eric Menendez were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury rejected the notion that they had acted out of immediate fear for their lives. Instead, they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision brought closure to a case that had consumed the nation for years, but it did not silence the debates. If anything, the convictions deepened the divide, leaving lingering questions about what had really happened behind the closed doors of the Menendez home. For many, the conviction seemed just. The brothers had committed a heinous crime, killing their parents in cold blood, and the law had delivered the appropriate punishment. But for others, the trial left unresolved issues. The allegations of abuse had been so detailed, so emotional, and so disturbing that they could not be dismissed entirely. Were the brothers lying to save themselves? or had the court ignored a painful truth because it was too inconvenient to acknowledge? As the 1990s moved forward, the Menendez case faded from the headlines, replaced by other sensational trials. But its impact remained. It had changed the way Americans viewed televised trials, set precedents for how allegations of abuse could shape legal defenses, and forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about family life behind closed doors. It had also highlighted the strange intersection of crime and entertainment in the modern era, where a murder case could become a form of daytime television for millions of viewers. The story of the Menendez brothers did not end with their convictions. They would live out their sentences in separate prisons, occasionally making headlines as journalists revisited their case. Documentaries were produced and public opinion shifted with time. Some continued to see them as greedy parasites, others as tragic figures who had finally broken under years of oppression. And as the years passed, the case became a mirror for broader discussions about family violence, privilege, and justice in America. The second part of this saga closes with the gavel's final strike, the life sentences delivered, and the courtroom emptied of its spectators. But outside those walls, the debates continued. The Menendez brothers were locked away, yet their story remained alive in the public imagination. And as time would show, interest in their case never truly disappeared. It only evolved, resurfacing in waves as new generations discovered the tale of two brothers whose crime had forever scarred the American landscape. When the trial concluded and the sentences were handed down, the Menendez brothers were no longer just defendants in a courtroom. They were convicted killers destined to spend the rest of their lives behind prison walls. Yet even after the verdict, their story refused to fade away. The crime, the spectacle of the trial, and the haunting question of why two young men from privilege could commit such an act lingered in the public consciousness. For some, the case represented justice served. For others, it remained an unresolved tragedy shaped as much by the system as by the crime itself. Life in prison marked a sharp contrast to the opulence the brothers had once known. Lyle and Eric were sent to separate facilities, a deliberate decision to prevent collaboration or conflict. The transition was not easy. From luxurious Beverly Hills living, designer clothes, and expensive cars, they found themselves in cells with steel bunks and rigid routines. The shock of confinement was compounded by the knowledge that they would never again walk free. For years, they lived in isolation from each other, communicating only through letters and the occasional monitored phone call. Their separation symbolized not only the legal punishment, but also the fractured bond of two brothers whose fate had been sealed by the crime they committed together. Despite their circumstances, both attempted to build some form of life inside prison walls. Lyle, the older brother, took on something of a leadership role among inmates, involving himself in group activities and eventually finding companionship in unexpected ways. Over the years, he married twice while incarcerated, demonstrating that even behind bars, the fascination with the Menendez name extended to the outside world. Eric, quieter and more reserved, found solace in writing and education, seeking to understand himself and the events that had defined his existence. Both brothers, in their own ways, adapted to the permanence of their new reality. But if prison brought physical separation and punishment, the outside world refused to let their story rest. The Menendez case continued to appear in documentaries, books, and television specials. Decades after the murders, new productions revisited the evidence, re-examined the family's history, and reignited debates over whether justice had truly been served. Some argued that the abuse allegations had never been properly considered, and that the system had favored a narrative of greed because it was simpler to digest. Others saw the continuing attention as an example of America's obsession with turning crime into entertainment, replaying the same tragedy for ratings and curiosity rather than truth. What kept the Menendez brothers in the cultural spotlight was not only the horror of the crime but also the complex psychology it exposed. Parricide, the act of children killing their parents, is among the rarest and most unsettling of crimes. It forces people to confront the fragility of the family structure, the place where love and loyalty are supposed to be strongest. The Menendez case became a lens through which the public explored broader themes of privilege, power, and the hidden dysfunctions of family life. In classrooms, criminal justice courses dissected the trial. In living rooms, families debated the morality of the brothers' actions. In courtrooms, Lawyers cited the case when arguing about the role of abuse in criminal defenses. As the years passed, the brothers' story evolved into something almost mythic. For those who believed them, they were tragic figures. Young men driven to desperation by relentless abuse, punished for surviving in the only way they knew how. For those who rejected their claims, they were entitled predators, using false allegations as a shield to justify the calculated murder of their parents. In either interpretation, they had become symbols, more than just individuals, representing different sides of a debate that cut to the core of justice and morality. The reunification of the brothers years later provided a poignant moment in their saga. After spending more than 2 decades apart, Lyle and Eric were finally housed in the same prison in California, able to see each other again face to face. The reunion was emotional, a reminder that despite everything, the crime, the trials, the decades of incarceration, they were still bound together by blood and shared history. For observers, the reunion humanized them once more, shifting the narrative from infamous murderers back to brothers who had lost everything, including their freedom and their family. Meanwhile, a younger generation discovered the Menendez story through new forms of media. The rise of streaming platforms, podcasts, and social networks revived interest in the case. Dramatizations, such as scripted television series, introduced the saga to audiences who had not been alive during the original trial. Documentaries re-examined old evidence, sometimes with a sympathetic angle, suggesting that the brothers' claims of abuse deserved a second hearing in the court of public opinion. Online, debates resurfaced, with some users declaring solidarity with the brothers and others condemning them as liars. The Menendez case, decades old, became relevant once again, its legacy carried forward by a culture that thrives on revisiting true crime stories. Inside prison, Lyle and Eric remained aware of the continued fascination with their case. They granted occasional interviews speaking about their childhood, the trial, and their lives behind bars. Their voices, older now, carried the weight of time and regret. Some heard sincerity in their words. Others dismissed them as manipulations. But regardless of interpretation, their presence in public conversation reminded everyone that the Menendez case was not just a chapter of history. It was a living story, still unfolding within the confines of prison walls. Beyond the personal saga of the brothers, the case left a profound impact on the legal system and popular culture. It demonstrated the power of televised trials, paving the way for later courtroom spectacles that would grip the nation, such as the O.J. Simpson trial. It raised critical questions about the role of psychological abuse in criminal defenses, pushing lawyers and courts to confront the complexity of family violence in ways that had rarely been considered before. And it revealed the public's appetite for true crime, a fascination that continues to this day, blending tragedy with entertainment in ways that blur the lines between justice and spectacle. As the decades moved forward, the Menendez brothers remained locked in their cells, serving out life sentences without parole. The world outside changed. Technology advanced, political landscapes shifted, new scandals emerged, but their fate remained constant. They were frozen in time, forever tied to the night of August 20th, 1989, and the choices that had defined their lives. For them, every day was a reminder of what had been lost. Parents, freedom, future. For the public, their case continued to serve as a reminder that even in the wealthiest households, darkness can exist just beyond the front door. The final chapter of their story is not one of resolution but of endurance. The Menendez brothers continue to live out their punishment, their names etched into the annals of American crime history. To some, they will always be remembered as murderers who coldly executed their parents for money. To others, they remain broken sons who lashed out after years of silent suffering. In the end, the truth may lie somewhere in between, an intersection of trauma, fear, entitlement, and rage that culminated in an act too horrific to fully comprehend. The Menendez case endures because it reflects the contradictions of human nature and the fragility of the family bond. It is a story of ambition and downfall, wealth and ruin, love and betrayal. Decades after the final verdict, its legacy still stirs debate, proving that some crimes are not confined to history books but live on as cultural touchstones. For America, the Menendez saga was never just about two brothers and their parents. It was about what happens when the foundations of family collapse, when secrets remain hidden until it is too late, and when justice itself struggles to define what is right and what is unforgivable. In the glittering heart of New York, an elderly millionaire vanished without a trace. What investigators uncovered was not just a murder, but a twisted alliance between a mother and her son, driven by greed, built on lies, and bound by a toxic love that destroyed everything. The story of Sante and Kenny Kimes begins not with the disappearance of Irene Silverman, but with the life of a woman who spent decades learning how to manipulate, deceive, and survive by bending every law she came across. To understand how the events of 1998 unfolded, one has to step back into the shadows of Sante's early years, where her hunger for wealth and status was born. Born in Oklahoma in the 1930s, Sante's childhood was not one of privilege, yet she carried within her a strong distaste for poverty. From a young age, she developed a fascination with appearances, how wealth, charm, and beauty could open doors. Those who knew her in her early life recalled a woman who never wanted to be ordinary, who always sought more than what she had. She was clever, ambitious, and remarkably persuasive. These traits would later evolve into tools for crime. Her first marriage ended in divorce, but it was her second marriage to a wealthy real estate developer, Kenneth Kimes Sr., that transformed her ambitions. With her new husband's money, Sante enjoyed the luxuries she had always desired: mansions, expensive clothes, international travel. Yet even with that security, her appetite for control and material gain was never satisfied. Instead of being content, she became addicted to the thrill of acquisition. To her, life was a chess game, and every person she encountered was a piece to be moved, manipulated, or discarded. Over the years, Sante began orchestrating elaborate schemes: fraudulent loans, scams involving maids and domestic workers, insurance manipulations, and property deals that always seemed to benefit her at someone else's expense. But what set her apart was her ability to maintain a facade of respectability. She dressed elegantly, spoke with authority, and presented herself as a woman of refinement. Behind the image, however, was a woman who thrived on deceit. It was during these years that her son Kenny came into her world. From the moment he was born, she viewed him not simply as a child to be nurtured, but as a partner in training. She raised him in a bubble of privilege but isolated him from outside influences. Where most mothers instill values of honesty and independence, Sante instilled secrecy, distrust, and blind loyalty. She taught him that rules were obstacles, and that the world was full of enemies ready to cheat them, so they must cheat first. Kenny grew up in the shadow of his mother's domination, his identity shaped not by choice but by her relentless conditioning. As Kenny grew older, Sante's control deepened. Friends and outsiders noticed how unusually close the two were, how Kenny rarely made decisions without his mother's guidance. He was handsome, intelligent, and capable of living a normal life, but he never truly had the chance. Sante's grip on him was psychological, emotional, and unbreakable. She reinforced the idea that they were a team against the world, that their survival depended on their unity. Slowly, the line between love and control blurred, and Kenny became her most trusted accomplice. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the mother and son crisscrossed the United States, leaving behind a trail of scams and suspicious incidents. They stayed in luxury hotels under false names, skipped out on bills, and used forged documents to gain advantages. Employees, associates, and acquaintances were often left betrayed or swindled, but few suspected the full extent of their criminal enterprise. Their crimes were not always violent, but the pattern of manipulation and exploitation was unmistakable. Sante seemed to thrive on seeing just how far she could push the boundaries. But deception has limits, and as their schemes grew bolder, the risks increased. By the mid-1990s, Sante was entangled in fraudulent dealings with associates who began to grow wary of her. One of them was David Kasdan, a businessman in Florida who had once been close to Sante. When he threatened to expose her illegal activities, he became a dangerous liability. In 1998, Kasdan was found dead in Los Angeles, shot and left in the trunk of his own car. Suspicion swirled around Sante and Kenny, though at that time there was not enough direct evidence to pin the crime on them. Still, it marked a shift, Their activities were no longer confined to financial scams. Violence had entered the equation. While the Kasdan case remained unresolved, Sante and Kenny turned their attention to New York. They set their sights on Irene Silverman, an elderly widow who had once been a former Radio City Rockette and now owned a luxurious townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Irene was wealthy, independent, and known for her strong personality. To Sante, she was not just another target. She was the gateway to prestige and permanent wealth. If Sante could seize control of Irene's property, it would be the crown jewel of her schemes. Posing as a mother and son seeking to rent an apartment, Sante and Kenny moved into Irene's townhouse. To Irene, something about them immediately seemed off. She was no stranger to people trying to take advantage of her, and she noticed inconsistencies in their behavior. Yet Sante, with her charm and manipulative skill, managed to delay suspicion long enough to settle in. Behind closed doors, however, their intentions were clear. They began drafting fraudulent documents, preparing forged deeds, and planning how they would assume control of Irene's fortune. But Irene Silverman was not an easy mark. She was shrewd, cautious, and quick to sense danger. In her diary, she began noting her unease about the new tenants, describing how their presence made her uncomfortable. Neighbors and staff at the townhouse also sensed tension, as Irene grew increasingly wary of the strangers under her roof. What Irene could not have known was that her suspicions placed her in grave danger. For Sante, once suspicion arose, the solution was not to retreat but to eliminate the obstacle. By July of 1998, Irene had vanished. She was last seen inside her townhouse, but she never emerged again. When friends realized she had not been in contact, alarm bells rang. Police were called, and almost immediately their investigation turned toward Sante and Kenny. The two had already checked into a nearby hotel, and when detectives searched their belongings, they uncovered a disturbing trove of evidence. Forged passports, fake driver's licenses, checkbooks, property documents, and handwritten notes detailing plans to seize Irene's assets. All were found in their possession. Among the notes were chilling references to disposing of the body, suggesting that Irene's disappearance had been carefully premeditated. Although Irene's body was never recovered, the sheer weight of evidence left little doubt about what had happened. To investigators, this was not just a missing persons case. It was a murder investigation, and the suspects were already in custody. What had begun decades earlier as scams and fraud had now escalated into a crime that shocked the nation. The mother and son who lived like drifters of luxury, always one step ahead of the law, had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. The disappearance of Irene Silverman would become the centerpiece of the case that brought them down. But it was only the climax of a long and twisted path of deception, manipulation, and greed. Part 1 ends with the capture of Sante and Kenny, caught with incriminating evidence in their possession, yet still defiant. For law enforcement, the challenge was only beginning. Without a body, could they prove murder? Without direct witnesses, could they unravel the strange, poisonous bond between a mother and her son? And most chilling of all, was Irene Silverman their only victim, or simply the last in a long line of casualties left behind by this destructive duo? The arrest of Sante and Kenny Kimes marked the beginning of a legal and investigative battle that would unravel one of the strangest mother-son partnerships in American criminal history. Detectives who first opened the pair's hotel room in Manhattan were stunned by what they found. The evidence inside spoke of more than fraud or forgery. It suggested a carefully constructed world of false identities, financial schemes, and potential violence. Each item cataloged added a new layer to the puzzle, painting a picture of people who lived entirely in deception. Among the most telling discoveries was a cache of documents suggesting an attempt to impersonate Irene Silverman and gain control over her fortune. Handwritten notes revealed strategies to transfer her property into their name. Alongside them were disguises, wigs, and dozens of fake IDs bearing Kenny's picture but under different names. These were not the belongings of petty criminals but of individuals who lived their lives as chameleons, shifting identities to match each scheme. Investigators soon realized that the pair operated like a traveling crime syndicate, but one fueled not by a network of associates but by a mother's domination and a son's obedience. The scope of their activities stretched across states, leaving behind unpaid hotel bills, duped acquaintances, and mounting suspicions of foul play. What had been found in New York was not just incriminating for the Silverman disappearance. It tied into a larger story, one that connected to unexplained deaths and financial frauds stretching back years. As detectives pieced together the timeline, a troubling connection emerged with the murder of David Kasdan earlier that year. Kasdan, once a close business associate of Sante, had fallen out with her after refusing to continue supporting her fraudulent deals. He had threatened to expose her use of falsified signatures on bank loans. Weeks later, his body was discovered in Los Angeles, shot and left in the trunk of his own car. Evidence later suggested Kenny had been the triggerman, acting under his mother's instructions. Although the Kasdan murder would not immediately be tried in New York, the connection painted a haunting picture of escalation. Financial schemes had evolved into eliminating those who threatened to expose them. Back in New York, prosecutors faced a daunting challenge. They had no body, no direct witness, and a pair of defendants who denied everything. Sante, even in custody, maintained her composure, presenting herself as a victim of misunderstanding, a refined woman unjustly accused. Kenny, younger and less seasoned, seemed caught between silence and nervous defiance. The two maintained their innocence, but investigators knew that convincing a jury without Irene Silverman's body would require every scrap of circumstantial evidence to be woven into an undeniable narrative. The courtroom drama that unfolded captivated the media. The case was already sensational. A wealthy socialite vanished, an eccentric mother-son team accused of plotting her demise, and a mystery deepened by the absence of a body. The press labeled them a twisted Bonnie and Clyde, though the relationship between them was more complex and unsettling than any romantic outlaw legend. Their bond, toxic and obsessive, became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Prosecutors laid out their argument with precision. They presented the mountain of evidence seized from the hotel room: forged checks, fake IDs, notes outlining how to assume control of Irene's townhouse, and even references to disposing of her remains. They introduced testimony from neighbors and building staff who described Irene's growing fear of the pair, recounting how she voiced suspicions shortly before she disappeared. The prosecution emphasized that Irene was not a woman who would simply vanish. She was wealthy, rooted in her community, and not the type to leave her life behind voluntarily. Forensic experts examined the documents, linking them directly to Sante and Kenny. Handwriting analysis confirmed their authorship of the forged papers, and fingerprints placed them on items connected to Irene. The prosecution's narrative was clear. Irene Silverman had been targeted, manipulated, and ultimately eliminated because she stood in the way of Sante's ambitions. The defense, however, sought to dismantle the portrayal of the pair as cold-blooded killers. Their strategy centered largely on Kenny. They argued that he was a victim of his mother's psychological control, a young man raised in isolation, molded into a pawn without the ability to resist. Sante, they implied, was the mastermind. If crimes were committed, she orchestrated them, and Kenny merely followed. The defense also leaned heavily on the absence of a body, suggesting that without concrete proof of death, the possibility remained that Irene Silverman was alive. Sante herself relished the spotlight. On the stand, she alternated between charm and indignation. She painted herself as a sophisticated woman misunderstood by authorities, a victim of a media narrative that cast her unfairly. Observers in the courtroom noted how she seemed to thrive under attention, often more concerned with her image than the gravity of the charges. Kenny, in contrast, appeared conflicted. At times he seemed eager to defend his mother, at other times visibly uncomfortable when the evidence implicated him directly. As the trial stretched on, the psychological dynamics between mother and son became increasingly apparent. Witnesses described their relationship as unusually close, bordering on unhealthy. Experts in psychology were brought in to discuss the possibility of coercive control, the ways in which a dominant parent could shape a child into complicity. For the jury, however, the issue was not merely psychological, it was criminal responsibility. Slowly, the prosecution's case gained momentum. The sheer volume of incriminating material, combined with Irene's sudden and permanent disappearance, proved difficult to explain away. Even without a body, the evidence suggested intent, planning, and execution. The jury heard how the pair had left a trail of fraud stretching across decades, how their crimes were not isolated acts but part of a pattern of deceit escalating into murder. Beyond the facts, the trial revealed something deeper and darker: the corrosive power of a toxic bond. Kenny's life, once full of potential, had become entangled in his mother's schemes. Sante, brilliant yet destructive, had forged him into her partner in crime. Their actions were not the product of desperation but of calculated greed, executed with chilling unity. The court was not merely trying two individuals, it was trying the consequences of a relationship warped beyond recognition. When the time came for deliberations, the jury faced a monumental decision. Could they convict without a body? Could they find beyond reasonable doubt that Irene Silverman had been murdered? The answer, after days of careful consideration, was yes. The weight of evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. In 2000, both Sante and Kenny Kimes were found guilty of murder, conspiracy, burglary, forgery, and numerous related charges. The sentencing was decisive: life imprisonment without parole. For Sante, it was the end of a long career of deception. For Kenny, it was the sealing of a fate that had been written the moment he fell under his mother's control. As the verdict was read, Sante showed little outward emotion, maintaining her composure as though defiance alone could undo the outcome. Kenny, younger and visibly shaken, seemed less able to mask the weight of the moment. For the public, the convictions brought a sense of closure to Irene Silverman's disappearance. Even though her body was never found, the court had spoken, and justice, though imperfect, had been served. Yet even with the convictions, questions lingered. How many others had fallen victim to the Kimes schemes, whose stories had never come fully to light? How deeply had Sante's influence carved into Kenny's psyche, shaping him into what he became? And most haunting of all, what became of Irene Silverman's remains? Hidden forever by two people whose lives revolved around secrets, the trial had answered some questions, but others would remain unsolved. Still, the message was clear. The era of Sante and Kenny Kimes roaming freely was over. For the first time, their web of lies had unraveled completely, and there was no escape. When the heavy prison doors finally closed behind Sante and Kenny Kimes, it marked the end of their freedom but not the end of their story. For a mother who had once lived in mansions, worn diamonds, and commanded her son like a queen ruling over a loyal soldier, life behind concrete walls was a sharp, humiliating descent. For Kenny, who had never known a life apart from his mother's influence, imprisonment was both punishment and, in an unexpected way, the beginning of his awakening. Inside prison, Sante initially attempted to maintain the same control and composure she had always projected in the outside world. She was not the type to accept defeat easily. Even among inmates, she carried herself with airs of superiority, a woman who still saw herself as above the system that confined her. She spent her days drafting legal motions, writing letters, and spinning narratives about how she and Kenny were victims of a grand conspiracy. She held tightly to her belief that the world had misunderstood her, that her brilliance had been misinterpreted as manipulation, and that her schemes had been exaggerated into crimes. But prison has a way of stripping illusions. Over time, Sante's power diminished. She was no longer feared or admired. She was simply another inmate serving time. The routines of incarceration left little room for manipulation, and the walls that once hid her lies now confined her every movement. For a woman who had thrived on deception, the lack of an audience was a slow, crushing punishment. For Kenny, prison was a different experience. Unlike his mother, who had spent decades honing her identity as a manipulator, Kenny entered prison as a man in his early 30s, with much of his life still ahead of him. Initially, he clung to his mother even from behind bars, maintaining contact, following her instructions, and defending her version of events. Yet as years passed and the enforced separation took its toll, cracks began to appear in his loyalty. The absence of her constant voice in his ear allowed him, for the first time, to think independently. In rare interviews conducted from prison, Kenny began to reveal the extent of his mother's control. He spoke about the way she isolated him from peers, how she convinced him that outsiders were dangerous, and how she taught him to see deception as survival. He admitted to the suffocating bond that made it nearly impossible for him to imagine disobeying her. In his words, he had been brainwashed, molded into an accomplice before he ever had the chance to choose otherwise. These reflections did not erase his culpability, but they offered a haunting glimpse into the psychological grip Sante had maintained over him. For investigators and journalists, the case remained a subject of fascination long after the verdict. Books were written, documentaries produced, and experts analyzed the toxic bond that had defined the Kimes' lives. Criminologists debated whether Kenny should be seen as a victim as much as a perpetrator. Some argued that his actions, no matter how influenced by his mother, were still choices for which he bore responsibility. Others viewed him as an example of extreme parental coercion, a man whose moral compass had been systematically dismantled by the one person who should have built it. Meanwhile, the families of the victims lived with the unanswered questions. Irene Silverman's loved ones never received the closure of recovering her remains. Her absence lingered like a shadow, a life erased without trace. For them, justice felt partial. A conviction without a body could never fully heal the wound of not knowing where she was. Similarly, the death of David Kasdan, though linked to the Kimes, remained one more reminder of how many lives had been shattered in their pursuit of wealth and control. As years turned into decades, Sante's health began to decline. The once sharply dressed woman, always conscious of appearance, grew frail in prison. Time stripped away the glamour and left behind only the reality of age and confinement. By 2014, she was in her late 70s, and the weight of her crimes and her years of incarceration caught up with her. She died behind bars, never having admitted guilt, never offering remorse, and never revealing the fate of Irene Silverman's body. Her death closed one chapter but left behind the same unanswered mysteries she had carried to her grave. For Kenny, his mother's death brought a strange liberation. No longer bound to her physically or emotionally, he began to express himself more openly. He gave more candid interviews, reflecting on the destructive influence she had exerted over him. He spoke of regret, of the wasted potential of his life, and of the moments when he wished he had broken away from her control. Yet regret could not undo decades of complicity, nor could it return the lives that had been lost. His prison sentence remains a constant reminder of the price of loyalty misplaced in the hands of a manipulative parent. The legacy of the Kimes case is more than just the record of their crimes. It stands as a study in the dangerous extremes of parental influence, the ways in which love, loyalty, and dependence can be twisted into instruments of destruction. Theirs was not a typical criminal partnership forged out of shared greed. It was born in the nursery, nurtured in secrecy, and solidified in adulthood through fear and control. Kenny's tragedy lay not only in the crimes he committed, but in the life he never had the chance to live, overshadowed from the beginning by a mother whose ambitions consumed everything. Even today, criminologists and psychologists reference the Kimes case when discussing coercive control and criminal complicity. It challenges traditional ideas of responsibility, forcing society to ask, when someone is raised in isolation, manipulated into believing lies as truth, and bound by a toxic bond, how much freedom of choice do they truly have? Yet the law, in the end, does not weigh emotional bonds, it weighs actions. And Kenny's actions, alongside his mother's, left an indelible mark on the lives of their victims. In reflecting on the case, one is struck not only by the cruelty of the crimes but by the banality of their origins. At its core, it was about greed, the desire for wealth, status, and control. Yet what elevated it into one of the most chilling cases of the late 20th century was the relationship between mother and son. It is one thing to imagine strangers conspiring in crime. It is another to see a parent mold their child into an accomplice, blurring the line between nurture and corruption until both are destroyed. Today, Kenny remains behind bars, his youth long gone, his life shaped by choices he now admits he wishes he had never made. His reflections, though tinged with remorse, serve as a warning. The power of manipulation, especially within families, can create outcomes more devastating than anyone can foresee. Sante's story ended in prison death, Kenny's continues in confinement, and the memory of Irene Silverman lives on as the victim whose absence still speaks louder than words. The saga of Sante and Kenny Kimes leaves behind a chilling truth. Crimes of greed and manipulation may begin with lies and forged documents, but when nurtured in secrecy and bound by loyalty, they can escalate into irreversible tragedy. a mother who should have protected instead destroyed, and a son who should have chosen freedom instead followed her into darkness. Their story endures as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are not made of bars and concrete, but of the invisible chains forged by love turned toxic and loyalty turned fatal. On a spring night in Oregon, a frantic mother rushed her blood-soaked children to the hospital, claiming a stranger had ambushed them on a dark road. But as the evidence unfolded, suspicion turned inward, revealing a chilling truth, that the greatest danger sometimes comes from the person we trust most. On a calm evening in Springfield, Oregon, the ordinary rhythm of life carried on like any other spring night. Families were winding down, porches were lit with soft lamps, and the air carried that mixture of damp soil and blooming flowers that marked the season. But what entered the emergency bay of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital that night was anything but ordinary. A car, streaked with blood both inside and out, screeched to a halt. Behind the wheel was a frantic young woman whose cries echoed through the corridor. She shouted that her children had been shot by a stranger on a deserted road. Inside the vehicle lay a scene of horror that no one present would ever forget. On the back seat, 3 small children were slumped, their tiny bodies riddled with bullets. One child was already lifeless, her young face frozen in eternal silence. Another child was barely breathing, fighting desperately for survival, and the third was paralyzed, his body forever altered by the violence of the attack. Medical staff rushed to their aid, moving with a grim determination, yet unable to shake the strangeness of the mother who had brought them in. Her panic was loud, yet somehow hollow. To the nurses and doctors who witnessed her behavior, something felt wrong. When questioned, she explained that a man had stepped out of the shadows, his hair messy and unkempt, his face obscured. He had supposedly flagged her down on a lonely stretch of road, demanding her car. When she refused, he fired into the back seat where her children sat defenseless. She insisted that she barely managed to escape with her life and drive them to the hospital. It was a chilling story, and in those first few moments, the idea of a gunman lurking on the rural highways of Oregon sent ripples of fear through the community. But beneath the surface, doubt began to grow. The investigators who arrived at the hospital found themselves confronted not only by a brutal crime but by contradictions in the woman's account. She appeared oddly composed at times, speaking in tones that sounded rehearsed rather than raw. There was little evidence of a struggle. Her arms bore no defensive wounds, and her clothing showed no sign of the violent encounter she described. The bloodstains on her were minimal, and her demeanor seemed disturbingly detached, as though she was narrating an event that had happened to someone else. In the days that followed, police retraced her steps, revisiting the desolate road where she claimed the attack occurred. The place was as she described, quiet, remote, lined with trees and brush. Yet there was no sign of the bushy-haired stranger she spoke of. No tire tracks, no footprints in the dirt, no discarded shells, nothing to suggest the presence of anyone else. For detectives, the absence of evidence spoke louder than any words. Meanwhile, the town was shaken. Springfield was not the kind of place where children were gunned down on empty roads. Parents held their own children closer, frightened by the thought of a faceless killer on the loose. The local media amplified the unease, reporting the attack in urgent tones, highlighting the tragedy of the young victims. But even as the story spread, law enforcement quietly began to consider a darker possibility, that the threat was not from outside but from within. As the children fought for their lives, the mother, Diane Downs, became the focus of both sympathy and scrutiny. She spoke to reporters, often with surprising openness, recounting the terrifying events as though she were reliving them for an audience. Her words, however, carried an unsettling undertone. She described the gunfire and the chaos, but the emotional weight of a grieving parent was strangely absent. Observers noted that she smiled at odd moments, as if caught between 2 conflicting performances, one as the victim and another as a storyteller. Her past began to emerge piece by piece. Diane was only 27, a postal worker with 3 young children she mostly raised on her own after a divorce. Friends and acquaintances remembered her as someone lively, attractive, and independent, yet restless and dissatisfied. She had grown up in Arizona, married young, and struggled through a turbulent relationship that eventually dissolved. In Oregon, she carried herself with a boldness that could be mistaken for confidence but often edged into recklessness. She was known to pursue men with intensity, her romantic entanglements frequently messy and consuming. It was during one of these affairs that detectives believed they had found a motive. Diane had been deeply involved with a man who made it clear he wanted no part of fatherhood. To him, her children were not only a complication but an obstacle to any future together. For Diane, who had become fixated on this relationship, the words cut deep. Those close to her recalled her speaking of the struggle between her desire for love and the demands of raising 3 young children. To the outside world, she was a mother juggling life after divorce. To investigators, she was beginning to look like someone who saw her own children not as blessings, but as barriers. As detectives compared her story with the evidence, contradictions mounted. Witnesses recalled seeing her car that night moving slowly, far too slowly for a mother racing her children to emergency care. Inside the car, the forensic team found no signs of a stranger's presence. The bullet casings were consistent with a weapon Diane herself was known to own. Each discovery chipped away at the fragile facade she presented. In the hospital, the 2 surviving children faced a long, agonizing recovery. Danny, the youngest, would never walk again. His spinal injury left him permanently paralyzed. Christy, the eldest, clung to life, her body scarred inside and out. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her, and for weeks she hovered on the brink. But gradually, she began to heal. When she finally regained the ability to speak, detectives saw her as the key witness, the only person besides Diane who truly knew what had happened inside that car on the night of the shooting. As law enforcement continued their quiet but steady investigation, Diane's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. Instead of withdrawing in grief, she sought the spotlight, granting interviews, discussing the night of the attack with a strange detachment. She even smiled for cameras, as if performing a role. At times she seemed to relish the attention, as though the tragedy had become her stage. For investigators, these performances were not the actions of a devastated mother, but of someone carefully controlling her narrative, someone aware that suspicion was circling closer. By the time weeks turned into months, the case had shifted entirely. What began as a hunt for a shadowy stranger had evolved into a focused inquiry into a mother's betrayal. To prove it would require not only evidence but also courage from the tiny survivors who had lived the nightmare. Christy, though fragile, carried within her the truth that could expose the darkness no one wanted to believe, that the very woman who had brought her into the world might have been the one who tried to take her out of it. The stage was set for a legal battle that would grip the nation. But in those early days, before the trial and the headlines, there was only a haunting question that echoed through Springfield. Could a mother really do this to her own children? As Christy slowly regained her strength in the hospital, investigators remained patient. They knew her fragile body was recovering from both physical trauma and emotional devastation. Doctors and detectives worked side by side, carefully planning how and when to approach her. The last thing they wanted was to burden her with interrogation before she was ready. But they also understood that within this child's memory lay the most vital piece of the puzzle. If she could recount what happened, the mystery would no longer rest on circumstantial evidence. It would have a voice. Meanwhile, Diane Downs lived her life outside the hospital walls in a way that unsettled even seasoned law enforcement officers. She did not retreat into privacy, nor did she grieve quietly. Instead, she gave interviews, smiled into cameras, and described the events of that night as if she were narrating someone else's story. Her choice of words often raised eyebrows. Instead of focusing on her children's suffering, she spoke of her own pain, her own struggles. Some interviewers remarked that she seemed more eager to explain how the incident affected her than to plead for justice or express sorrow. What stood out most was the odd detachment. In one televised appearance, she smiled as she spoke about the shooting, almost as if reliving an anecdote rather than a nightmare. To viewers at home, her demeanor appeared chilling. To prosecutors building a case, it was a gift. The public began to question her story, and sympathy turned to suspicion. Newspapers carried headlines that painted her less as a victim and more as a suspect, fueling a national fascination with the unfolding tragedy. Behind closed doors, detectives pieced together the evidence. The bullets matched a weapon that Diane had been known to carry. The car bore no signs of forced entry or struggle. The slow drive to the hospital suggested calculation rather than desperation. But though the evidence grew damning, it was still not absolute. The prosecution needed something irrefutable. And in the hushed halls of the hospital, Christie prepared to provide it. When the moment finally came, detectives approached the child with care. The girl, pale but resilient, had survived an unimaginable ordeal. Sitting in the hospital room, she was asked gently about what she remembered. Her answer shattered any lingering doubt. With halting words, she revealed that it had not been a stranger who raised the gun that night. It was her own mother. Those words, spoken softly by a child, became the cornerstone of the case. News of Christie's testimony spread quickly through law enforcement circles. It was both heartbreaking and definitive. For investigators who had spent weeks unraveling contradictions, this was the confirmation they had long suspected but dreaded to hear. The horror lay not in the mechanics of the crime, but in the betrayal it represented. A mother's arms are meant to protect, not to destroy. Yet here was a girl forced to live with the memory that the person she trusted most had turned the weapon on her. With Christie's statement secured, the prosecution began shaping their narrative for the courtroom. They would present Diane not as a grieving mother but as a calculating woman who valued her romantic obsessions more than her children's lives. They unearthed her history of affairs, highlighting the relationship with the married man who had made it clear he did not want children. Letters between them revealed her longing for a future that could not include her kids. For the jury, the motive would be plain. The children were obstacles to be removed. As the trial approached, the small town of Springfield found itself thrust into the national spotlight. Television crews arrived, reporters filled the courthouse steps, and the case became a spectacle that fascinated the country. In living rooms across America, people debated whether a mother could truly commit such an act. Some still clung to the possibility of her innocence, unsettled by the idea of condemning a woman based on the testimony of a wounded child. Others were convinced by the mounting evidence that Diane was not a victim at all but the architect of the tragedy. When the trial began in 1984, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken, and the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Diane, dressed carefully and carrying herself with confidence, entered like a performer walking onto a stage. She often smiled at the jurors, occasionally even at the cameras. For some, her demeanor seemed like arrogance. For others, it was unsettling charm. She gave the impression of someone who still believed she could control the narrative, just as she had tried to control it in her interviews. The prosecution laid out the case meticulously. They presented the ballistic evidence showing how the bullets matched her weapon. They described the inconsistencies in her story, the slow drive to the hospital, the lack of evidence of any intruder. But the centerpiece of their argument was Christie. When the young girl took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. Fragile and nervous, she told the jury the truth she had held inside. Her voice may have been soft, but its impact was thunderous. She testified that her mother had pulled the trigger. Gasps filled the courtroom. It was a moment no one present would ever forget. A child testifying against her own mother is a scene of almost unbearable tragedy. Yet it was also the most powerful evidence of all. Jurors saw the pain in Christie's eyes, and they recognized the courage it took to speak those words. Her testimony carried an authenticity that no expert witness or piece of forensic evidence could match. The defense tried to counter. They argued that Diane was the victim of media bias, that she was being portrayed unfairly as a monster. They questioned the reliability of a traumatized child's memory, suggesting Christie's recollection could have been influenced. They painted Diane as a misunderstood woman, someone who had made mistakes in love, but who adored her children. But as the trial wore on, their arguments seemed thin against the overwhelming weight of the evidence. The courtroom became a stage where the contrast between appearances and reality was stark. On one side sat Diane, composed, articulate, and smiling. On the other side were the children, their injuries, their scars, their silence more powerful than any words. Danny, permanently confined to a wheelchair, was living proof of the violence unleashed that night. Christy, though alive, carried the weight of testifying against the very person who had given her life. By the time the trial neared its end, the public's perception of Diane had shifted almost completely. She was no longer the frantic mother who had burst into a hospital seeking help. She had become a symbol of cold-blooded selfishness, a woman who placed her desires above her duty as a parent. Her charm and confidence, once perhaps disarming, now appeared as calculated manipulation. The jury deliberated, weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and the haunting words of a child. It was not just a question of law but of morality. Could they believe that a mother had turned a gun on her children? Could they condemn her for it? The answer, they would soon decide, would echo far beyond the walls of that Oregon courthouse. The jury filed back into the courtroom after long hours of deliberation, their expressions grim, their decision etched in the silence that followed them. Everyone inside the packed chamber seemed to hold their breath, waiting to hear if justice would finally align with the dreadful truth that had unfolded over weeks of testimony. When the foreman stood and delivered the verdict, the words fell like heavy stones. Guilty of murder, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of assault. Diane Downs, the woman who had once stood before television cameras as a victim, was now declared the perpetrator of one of the most shocking crimes in Oregon's history. The weight of the conviction was immense, but so too was the sentence that followed. Life in prison plus 50 years. The judge, addressing her directly, made clear that society could not risk allowing her the freedom to harm again. He spoke of the children, their innocence, their suffering, their courage, and contrasted it with Diane's cold calculation. For many in the courtroom, the verdict was a relief, an affirmation that justice had triumphed over deception. Yet it was also a moment tinged with sorrow. A mother had been condemned not only by the system but by her own surviving child's testimony. The betrayal was complete, and the community of Springfield, once shrouded in fear, now sat in stunned reflection. The trial ended, but the story did not fade. The media had turned Diane into a figure of national fascination. Documentaries, articles, and television segments dissected her behavior, her motives, and her chilling calmness throughout the ordeal. Viewers across America debated the nature of evil. Was Diane a monster by choice, or a product of deep psychological flaws? She seemed to thrive on the attention, granting interviews even after her conviction, proclaiming her innocence, and blaming shadowy strangers for crimes the evidence had already disproven. Her refusal to accept responsibility became part of her infamy. For Christy and Danny, the end of the trial marked not closure, but the beginning of a new life shaped by both trauma and resilience. They were adopted by the lead prosecutor, Fred Hughey, and his wife. The couple gave them a stable home, shielding them from the media storm that continued to swirl around their biological mother. Christy, having testified with extraordinary bravery, carried the scars of both her injuries and the emotional weight of condemning her mother. Danny faced a lifetime in a wheelchair, the physical reminder of the night his life was changed forever. And yet, in the safety of their new home, they found space to heal, to grow, and to live lives no longer overshadowed by Diane's presence. The case continued to haunt those who had been involved. Detectives remembered the chilling contrast between Diane's outward charm and the darkness of her actions. Nurses who worked that night in the emergency room recalled her detachment and how their instincts had been right from the very beginning. Journalists who covered the trial spoke of the unsettling task of reporting on a mother accused of targeting her own children. The collective memory of the case became less about the gruesome mechanics of the crime and more about the deeper questions it raised about trust, betrayal, and the human capacity for cruelty. In the years that followed, Diane Downs attempted to appeal her conviction. She maintained her innocence in letters and interviews, insisting that a stranger had been responsible. Each time, courts reviewed her petitions and rejected them, finding no grounds to overturn the jury's decision. Her narrative never changed, even as decades passed. To those who knew the case, Her denial was not a sign of hope but of her inability to confront the truth of her actions. Life behind bars did not diminish her notoriety. She gave occasional statements, often in tones that echoed her earlier interviews, part defiance, part self-pity. She described her life in prison, painted herself as misunderstood, and hinted at conspiracies. Yet the world beyond her cell had largely moved on, remembering her not as a wronged woman but as one of the most infamous mothers in American crime history. The cultural impact of the case extended far beyond Oregon. True crime enthusiasts, legal scholars, and psychologists dissected the story in classrooms and books. What drove Diane to such lengths? Was it purely the desperation of a woman clinging to a doomed relationship? Or was there something deeper in her psychology, a narcissism so profound that even motherhood could not temper it? Experts debated, but answers remained elusive. What was undeniable was the devastating outcome. Children sacrificed for the illusion of love. For the people of Springfield, the story remained a painful chapter in their community's history. Each anniversary of the crime brought back memories of that quiet spring night turned into tragedy. Yet it also reminded them of the resilience of the survivors. Christy and Danny's journey symbolized hope in the aftermath of horror. Despite the violence inflicted upon them, they endured, carrying forward the strength that their mother had so terribly lacked. Over time, the narrative of the Diane Downs case evolved. It was no longer only the story of a crime, but of its aftermath, of children who rebuilt their lives, of a justice system that pursued truth against manipulation, and of a society forced to confront the possibility that evil can reside in the most unexpected of places. The image of Diane's smiling face in interviews remained etched in the public mind, serving as a chilling reminder that appearances can deceive, and that beneath a mother's smile can lurk the unthinkable. Even decades later, the case continues to resonate because it touches on something primal: the bond between parent and child. That bond, assumed to be unbreakable, was shattered in the most violent way. And it is in that shattering that the horror truly lies. A stranger with a gun is terrifying, but the betrayal of a mother pulling the trigger herself strikes deeper, challenging the very foundations of trust and love. As the years passed, Christy and Danny grew older, carrying with them the past they could never escape but also forging new paths. For those who followed their story, they became the enduring symbol of survival. They did not choose their suffering, but they chose to live beyond it. Their courage offered a counterbalance to the darkness of their mother's crime, proving that even in the wake of unspeakable betrayal, resilience can prevail. And so the Diane Downs case remains, etched in the annals of true crime, not just for its brutality but for what it reveals about human nature. It is a story of love corrupted into obsession, of innocence destroyed, of justice fought for and won. Above all, it is a story that forces us to ask the hardest questions about trust and betrayal. For every person who hears it, one thought lingers. If danger can come from the very person meant to protect, where, then, can safety truly be found?